this is International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com, and today I will be discussing an exchange sacrifice on c3 in the Sicilian by black. And this is going to be a two-part series actually, because it's quite different, the exchange sacrifice in a dragon setup versus in some other setups, for example the Scheveningen style positions with pawns on e6 and d6, which is what I'm going to deal with today. So part 2 will show exchange sacrifices in the dragon, which I would say probably about 50% of games have them in the Yugoslav attack variation of the dragon. But today's lecture is on the Scheveningen, and the game I'm going to show is Gilberto Miloš versus Judit Polgar. This was played in a match in Sao Paulo in 1996, and shows a lot of themes for black in the Sicilian. So Miloš was white and started with the move e4. Polgar played c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6. So we have a Najdorf Sicilian Polgar is playing, and Miloš played bishop e3. So this is possibly heading to the English attack, but we'll see that actually Miloš had a different idea. So Polgar played e6, alternative of course e5 and knight g4. But she's heading into a Scheveningen style position after e6, and now English attack would be f3. This is of course a very common variation. Queen to d2, g4, castles queenside. And if you want to see an exchange sacrifice in this variation, you can look up the game Sicilian versus Kasparov in this opening, and you'll show it's a very a classic example of an exchange sacrifice by black and how it worked out. A very nice game, but I'm not going to show that in this lecture. In this game, Miloš played the move f4, which is somewhat rare. This setup is very aggressive for white. The plan is to put the queen on f3 and the bishop on d3, castles queenside, and g4. But on the other hand, black also gets everything he or she wants. So after f4, b5, very logical move. White can't take advantage of the early b5. The queen's not on f3 yet. So black gets his ideal setup: bishop b7, knight d7, rook c8, and so on, putting lots of pressure on white's e-pawn. And Miloš continued with the move queen f3. So the threat is e5 here. If e5 right away, I don't think this would turn out so well. After d takes e5, f takes e5. Now I believe b4. This should be good for black. I haven't checked the theory on this, but queen f3. So bishop b7, pinning the e-pawn. Bishop d3. The threat was b4, so white protects the e-pawn, and this is part of the setup. Knight b to d7, so knight can head to c5 and put more pressure on white's e-pawn. And now g4. So this is the most aggressive move. White hopes to chase the black knight from f6 as soon as possible to, of course, to weaken the pressure on the e-pawn, to make white have more freedom of action, and also eventual kingside attack or attacking the center as well. So very sharp line. And now black has a couple possibilities. For example, b4, knight c to e2, knight c5, knight g3. And the plan is, of course, to play g5 for white. And this is a very sharp line. I think one of black's options is e5. And I won't get into this too much, but here, of course, white has moved the knight from c3, so it's actually a lot safer on the white's queenside is actually a lot safer without the knight on c3. Don't have to worry about the exchange sacrifices, and white can castle and play king b1. Typically, when the knight moves away from c3 and the Sicilian is white, it helps white to avoid some dangers on the king's side, which we'll see. And of course, black can also just play the immediate knight c5. And g5, there's a possibility of b4 here. And this is one line: g takes f6, b takes c3, and now think b4 is one possibility. But the move Polgar chose is h6. So restraining white's kingside hopes. Of course, if white plays g5 right away, black can play h takes g5, f takes g5, knight e5 in between move, attacking the queen, and black has control of this very important e5 square. The knight is excellently posted there, and this just destroys all of white's hopes on the king side, because white's not going to be able to play g6 really. After the queen moves, for example, queen g2, now I guess the move knight h5 or knight f to d7, both possible. And this is, of course, if g6 is an interesting attempt, but there's perhaps queen h4. Anyway, this is probably not so promising for white. And meanwhile, the natural move h4, intending to play g5 and take back with the h-pawn, so not giving black the e5 square, can be met by the move h5, which is another common thing in these situations. After white has played h4, then black plays h5, so if white plays g5, black gets the g4 square. So this is, then the knight is very bothersome for white there. So this is another common thing. The move Miloš actually played, a3, is just, I don't like this move very much. White's committed on the king side and then doesn't continue aggressively. He's stopping b4, but so with white's king going, if white's king goes to the queen side, this will just turn out to be a weakness in most cases. And as we saw, the knight often wants to go to g3 anyway. So he ended up castling kingside. We'll see that. But I had done an analysis of this position. That's another point I wanted to show you. First of all, it shows a situation where the exchange sacrifice on c3 doesn't work, because it seems like in the Sicilian this exchange sacrifice is wonderful for black every time, but it's not actually the case. So what I analyzed was castles queenside, most aggressive move here, of course. Now, for example, rook c8, the move rook h to e1. I didn't like moving a knight from c3. Knight c to e2, knight c5, knight g3, and now black has a nice move, rook c7, planning to play queen a8 and increase the pressure on white's e-pawn. It's going to be very hard to defend here. For example, rook h to e1, preparing to protect the e-pawn, queen a8. White needs to move the bishop, so bishop g1, knight takes d3, and now, of course, white would love to take back with the c-pawn in most of these cases. If the king were on b1, everything would be fine for white. White takes back with the c-pawn and strengthens the center a lot, and also gets the open c-file. The rook will then go to c1, and it will be white that will take over the c-file. But here, of course, it's not possible to take with the c-pawn, so rook takes d3, and now looks like black gets good play with something like d5, for example, e5, knight e4, and if f5, bishop g4. And this looks like possible. It's a sharp position. I'm not sure what's going on here. This is an option for white. But interesting move I analyzed was after rook c8, rook h to e1, simply allowing black to sacrifice the exchange here. So first thing to consider would be the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes c3. Now b takes c3. And how is black going to continue? He can play queen a5, but then king b1. And the point is, this exchange sacrifice is not as promising for black, because white can easily create some threats in the center of the board to distract black from his attack. And if for example, queen takes c3, knight b3, and now bishop d4 is coming, then after bishop eventually can come to b2, white's king is perfectly safe, and then eventually prepare a breakthrough in the center with e5. So I analyzed the move. Instead of queen a5, queen a8, which looks logical because black's putting a lot of pressure on white's e-pawn. So after queen a8, white needs to protect, so bishop d2, knight c5, Black's winning the e-pawn, but we'll see that his king can come into serious danger. So g5. And knight f takes e4. And now I think f5. And this is very sharp, but very promising for white. So white's breaking through in the center. Black takes the bishop, attacking white's queen with the bishop on b7, so white can't recapture. And queen f4. And in this case, black's play has not worked out very well. The attack in the center is very strong. So, on another topic, if black doesn't, after rook hc1, if black doesn't sacrifice, b4 looks like a natural move. But I looked at the move knight d5, which is another thematic sacrifice in the Sicilian that players should know for white or black. And here the point is, if e takes d5, e takes d5, the e file is open up with huge attack. Knight c6 can come, or knight f5 is usually even stronger. And here the attack is very strong. For example, if bishop takes d5, bishop d2 check. Bishop e7, and queen h3. And now the threat is knight f5. And if black castles, the attack is really strong. For example, knight f5, rook e8, g5, and black will not be able to move his knights from there because the attack is really just crushing. So, for example, bishop e6, and the point is to give back the piece, but now white can break through with a nice combination. Rook takes e6, f takes d6, knight takes g7. White has completely winning attack. For example, king takes g7, queen takes h6, king g8, g takes f6, and then rook g1 check. So, another variation you might find interesting. The main variation I considered was not taking the knight with a pawn after knight d5, but actually knight takes d5, e takes d5, bishop takes d5. Now black should, if white just moves the queen, should have a pretty solid position. Extra pawn, and he can create his own threats on the queen side. Queen a5, knight c5, e6 pawn is well defended. So the only option really was the spectacular move queen takes d5. And now e takes d5 is forced. And it's not time to make a discovered check yet, of course. Just bring the pieces into better spots. So knight f5. And just to look, there's many possible variations for black. White has only one piece for the queen at the moment, but of course there's a really strong threat, bishop b6 check, as well as other discovered checks. Black really needs to just give back the piece to get castled. So for example, bishop e7, bishop d4, and castles. And now knight takes e7 check, king h8, and two pieces now for the queen, and white can even take the rook right now. But even better than that is the move g5, threatening g takes h6. If black plays h5, the move knight, even better than taking the rook, knight f5, with a very strong attack, threatening take on g7. So I analyze h takes g5, and now white can play rook e3, threatening rook h3 checkmate. And only defense is g4, and now very nice move rook g1, which threatens beautiful move rook h3, and if black takes it, bishop takes g7 is checkmate. So if black plays f5 to block white's bishop from d3, so after rook h3 he can take safely on h3, then very nice move rook g to g3, threatening rook h3 with checkmate, and there's no defense here. So, for example, now knight f6, white can just play, I think, just bishop takes f5, which renews the threat of rook to h3. So another nice variation is, instead of f5, knight e5, trying to block the long diagonal and take white's knight on e7. Then white plays rook takes g4. Again, black can't take on g4 because rook h3 check, knight h6, rook takes h6 is checkmate. So black takes on e7. Now f takes e5, and we see the power of these bishops. The threat is, well, there's so many threats it's hard to say, but rook h3 followed by bishop h7 is one, e takes d6 is one, and after, for example, rook f to e8 to clear space for black's king, rook takes g7 is decisive. If black takes it, then e takes d6, discovered check followed by taking the queen. Meanwhile, rook h3 is threatened. So this shows some of white's thematic sacrifices. But let's get back to the game now. It shows a very nice game that black played. Instead of castling queenside, Milos played the move a3. And now black simply played rook c8, a standard Sicilian move, bringing the rook to the open file. And now white decided to castle on the king side. If he castled queenside, it wouldn't be terribly logical, having played a3. So he would have to watch out for an eventual b4, just opening more lines, and as well as the exchange sacrifices with simply a tempo more for black, and the a3 pawn possibly hanging in some variations. So he castled kingside, and of course king is a little bit open over there. Now bishop e7, rook a to e1. White's main hope is some sort of breakthrough in the center, or after black tries to break out, then white opens things up. So rook a to e1. And now Polgar played a very nice move. This is another typical thematic Sicilian move. She played the move g5. Very common positional maneuver in the Sicilian for black. Simply undermining white's control of e5. So whatever white does, black's knight is getting into e5. And of course, with white's king on the king side, this is even more strong for black. Of course, because lines are opened up against white's king. So for example, if f takes g5, then knight e5 with tempo attacking white's queen. And queen g3, then knight f takes g4. Looks extremely strong for black. It's got a very powerful knight on e5, and white's king is in the firing line. For example, if white tries to move g6, even just the g file is going to be open no matter what. Even if g6, then black has a strong move like rook g8, and white can't keep the g file closed really. So he tried to keep lines closed with f5. Of course, this also cedes the e5 square to black. So now knight e5 Polgar played, attacking the queen. Queen h3. And now black has to deal with the threat to e6. F takes e6, and she found a very nice move, king d7. This was much better than some move like queen d7. First of all, black's king is actually safest here. Well, I mean, it would be safer on, for example, b8, but it's much better there than on e8, on d7. So she's protecting e6. The other thing is it connects the rooks. It gives black's queen access to, for example, the g file, and it keeps the queen on this d8 h4 diagonal, which we'll see is useful. So king d7, very nice move. And now white played the move, g4 is threatened, so white played the move bishop e2, protecting g4. And now, again, a nice move by black, h5. So it's time to open up the king side. I suppose white's lost here at this point. He played f takes e6, f takes e6, g takes h5. Of course, the pawn on g4 was threatened. Now white threatens e6, so black plays g4, queen g2, and here's where we see the standard Sicilian exchange sacrifice. And in many positions, this is simply a almost automatic move, and I'd say this is one of them. Rook takes c3. So some of the conditions that make this work here is, first of all, black is getting the e-pawn. In the Cheveningen, typically black will get the e-pawn in many cases, and she's doubling white's c-pawns. So here it's more important just the attack on white's king, but that's typically a factor as well. So basically black takes all the quality out of white's position, and by removing that knight is very important for controlling the center. So black gets control, of the long diagonal of e4. So these are some of the typical reasons for this exchange sacrifice. And you see that in many cases, particularly in ones coming from the dragon, from Yugoslav attack, it turns out that the rooks are not the strongest pieces in many Sicilian positions, because for white, open files are a little bit hard to use. Once the kingside attack is gone, the d file is very hard to use for white. So material is all relative to how strong the pieces are. In some conditions, knight is stronger than the rook. So, of course, white took on c3, and now bishop takes e4. So in this case, black just develops a devastating attack. White played queen f2. Of course, if queen g3, then knight takes h5 with tempo. So queen g2, or queen f2, he played. Now knight takes h5. So black has a huge number of threats. First off, bishop to h4, trapping the queen, is a major threat, and g3 is also coming. So I can't see any defense for white. Bishop f4 is what he played, and it looks like the only try to meet bishop h4 with bishop g3. I suspect that's winning for black as well, but even stronger was her move, g3, simply opening everything up. Now if bishop takes g3, then knight takes g3, and h takes g3 is impossible because of rook h1, checkmate. Meanwhile, queen takes g3 will be met by rook g8, winning the queen. So, of course, white's queen is under attack, and g takes h2 is coming if queen e3, followed by discovered checks. So, only try was h takes g3, and now knight takes f4. And white can't take with a g-pawn again because rook h1, checkmate. So he played queen takes f4, and now rook to h1 check, king f2, rook h2 check, and white is forced to give up the queen. If he played king g1, then rook g2 check, king h1, and queen h8 would be the simplest win for black. So king e3, and now bishop g5. Notice how this knight on e5 is just dominating, and it has been ever since black played g5. So after bishop g5, the game ended king takes e4, bishop takes f4, g takes f4, and now, while white has a bishop and a rook for the queen, of course, he's completely lost, and she played the nice move, rook h3, cutting off white's king retreat. And after f takes e5, for example, black can just play queen h4 check, and rook f4 d5 is checkmate. So he played the move knight takes e6, but after king takes e6, he resigned, seeing that f takes e5, one possible win is queen a8 check. If king d4, then queen d5 is mate. And if king f4, then f takes e5 and king g4, queen g2 is mate. So this shows a lot of Sicilian themes, one of them being the sacrifice on c3. And in my next lecture I'll show those sacrifices that stem from a Yugoslav attack in the dragon, where it's somewhat different because usually black doesn't win the white e-pawn. So we have whole different themes, and in those many of the endgames are good for black as well, with an exchange down. But this has been on the Scheveningen variation. So this has been International Master Bryan Smith showing sacrifices on c3 in the Sicilian.